Thomas Jefferson went to church for 8 years in the Congress building. In the building of Congress, they held church services, and he attended that.
And he was a deist, I think.
Well, they say that, but he called himself a Christian. In the era where we're supposed to respect how people identify themselves, he has zero statements saying, I'm a deist. He has many...
I want to share some passages with you all of Thomas Jefferson's writings over the years to see if you would arrive at the same conclusion or even share the same attitude about Thomas Jefferson's Christianity as the street preacher does. And before I do think it is very important to mention that Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner. He fathered at least 6 children with one of his slaves, a woman named Sally Hemings, whom he raped. She would have been a teenager around the same time that Thomas Jefferson was a full-grown adult, so there's that. But I do think it is important to mention because regardless of how morally reprehensible and morally bankrupt we might view the situation today, it wasn't back then. Back then, these actions would have been perfectly aligned with biblical principles and the biblical teachings of that time, something that obviously required societal change for us to view as wrong. So this passage is about the Holy Trinity, that thing that's like very important to Christianity today. About the Holy Trinity, Thomas Jefferson writes, "The hocus pocus phantasm of a god like another Cerberus, with one body and 3 heads, had its birth and growth in the blood of thousands and thousands of martyrs. In fact, the Athanasian paradox that 1 is 3 and 3 but 1 is so incomprehensible to the human mind that no candid man can say he has any idea of it. And how can he believe what presents no idea? He who thinks he does only deceives himself. He proves also that man, once surrendering his reason, has no remaining guard against absurdities the most monstrous, and like a ship without a rudder is the sport of every wind. With such persons, gullibility, which they call faith, takes the helm from the hand of reason, and the mind becomes a wreck." Now, what is Thomas Jefferson really saying here? Well, we know that the Holy Trinity comes from the Athanasian Creed, and here Thomas Jefferson calls the Athanasian Creed an Athanasian paradox because how could it be that the Holy Trinity, how could it be that God is the same as the Son and the Holy Spirit? How can they be 3 separate entities but also just be one entity? It's a paradox, right? And he's saying that it's a bunch of bullshit, basically. He's saying it's magic. He calls it hocus pocus. That's literally what he calls it, word for word. He's saying that if you believe in this hocus pocus, you've pretty much lost all your faculties. Like, you can be pretty much privy to anything. Anybody could take advantage of you. You're like a ship without a rudder. Whatever somebody tells you, you'll believe. He's pretty much saying that if you believe in this, you're kind of just dumb. But wait, there's more. In this letter, he writes, "Although I rarely waste time in reading on theological subjects as mangled by our pseudo-Christians, yet I can readily suppose that Bazanistos may be amusing." And Bazanistos is it comes from the Greek word bazanistes, and bazanistes is somebody who tortures somebody else. So he's using it sort of ironically here, saying that, he's pretty much the challenge is going to be amusing to him. So he says, "Yet I can readily suppose Bazanistos may be amusing. Ridicule is the only weapon which can be used against unintelligible propositions. Ideas must be distinct before reason can act upon them, and no man ever had a distinct idea of the Trinity. It is the mere abracadabra of the mountebanks." Mountebanks is another word for a charlatan. So a charlatan is somebody who pretends like they know about something and then just, doesn't really know about it and just continues preaching regardless. So he says, "It is the mere abracadabra of the mountebanks calling themselves the priests of Jesus. If it could be understood, it would not answer their purpose." Now, these are pretty strong words for somebody that calls himself a Christian about one of the central tenets of Christianity, but what is Thomas Jefferson really saying here? He's saying the idea of the Holy Trinity is ridiculous. He's saying it's a bunch of mumbo-jumbo, and he says the only way to deal with mumbo-jumbo is by ridiculing it. On top of this, he says, if you believe in this and you preach it, you are a charlatan. Now, I've shown you 2 distinct passages where Thomas Jefferson clearly calls one of the central tenets of Christianity nothing more than a bunch of bullshit. Now, I ask you, is this somebody that would pass as a Christian today? Do you think Christians would accept Thomas Jefferson's beliefs? Think about him as a Republican candidate somewhere. He would have been crucified. Now let's continue, because not only does Thomas Jefferson have a problem with the Holy Trinity, he also has a problem with much of the scripture. In this passage he writes, "But the greatest of all the reformers of the depraved religion of his own country was Jesus of Nazareth. Abstracting what is really his from the rubbish in which it is buried, easily distinguished by its luster from the dross of his biographers, and as separable from that as the diamond from the dunghill, we have the outlines of a system of the most sublime morality which has ever fallen from the lips of man, outlines which it is lamentable he did not live to fill up. Now again, think about what Thomas Jefferson is really saying here. He's saying that in order to remove the teachings of Jesus from the rest of the Bible, which he thinks is bullshit, would be analogous to removing diamonds from a dunghill. What Christian do you know that would use that analogy? I mean, he's saying that Jesus' teachings are diamonds and the rest of the books in the Bible are a bunch of bullshit. Literally a mountain of bullshit, a dunghill. And now, believe it or not, that's not even the only instance in which he uses the exact same analogy. In this letter, he writes, "The whole history of these books," and he's talking about the Gospels here, "is so defective and doubtful that it seems vain to attempt minute inquiry into it. And such tricks have been played with their text and with the text of other books relating to them that we have a right from that cause to entertain much doubt what parts of them are genuine. In the New Testament, there is internal evidence that parts of it have proceeded from an extraordinary man, and that other parts are of the fabric of very inferior minds. It is as easy to separate those parts as to pick out diamonds from a dunghill." And if you're still not seeing the pattern of why somebody like Thomas Jefferson would have a keen interest in the separation of church and state, let me read you this passage on his feelings about preachers. He says, "History, I believe, furnishes no example of a priest-ridden people maintaining a free civil government. This marks the lowest grade of ignorance of which their civil as well as religious leaders will always avail themselves for their own purposes." This sentiment that he has about preachers is pretty common throughout his life, and it gets only worse after the 1800s because in that time, the election of 1800 and the election after that, it's revealed that Thomas Jefferson, he makes a version of his own Bible pretty much where he literally takes a little knife and cuts out the verses of Jesus' teachings and pretty much puts them in his own, in the Bible of its own. So that's called the Jeffersonian Bible. Well, at the time when he was running for president, the opposition party used this against him and called him an atheist, said that he was kind of a heretic. I mean, he called him all sorts of things. And this is where Thomas Jefferson's hatred for the pulpit and for preachers and priests really began. Now, in the rest of the video, the preacher here argues that Thomas Jefferson attended Mass in the Capitol building, which is true, that did happen, but I think it's sort of devoid of any historical context that would be important here. And it's important to mention that at the time when the Capitol building was first constructed, there wasn't really any other community center. And so when Congress wasn't in session, those rooms could kind of be available to the public to use for whatever they needed it to. And sometimes churches went there because there wasn't any other churches constructed at that time. So that's sort of the context here. The other context is that after the 1800 election, because of all the damage that happened from the Christians calling him an atheist because of his religious views, he sort of had to maintain a good public image, and I think that was part of it. Now, hopefully with this additional context, you can sort of see why Thomas Jefferson would be somebody that would have a keen interest in preserving the separation of church and state, because he had less than traditional views about Christianity. Well, we could just put it that way. But you can see why he would want to preserve this distinction, because if not, I mean, he could just be persecuted, right? It wasn't uncommon back then that Christians would persecute themselves. Nowadays, you hear from Christians that the state and the government, other religions are persecuting them. Once you remove those people from the equation, they just sort of point the fingers at themselves. I mean, this is what has been going on for a long time. There's been a centuries-long battle in Ireland, for example, between the Protestants and the Catholics. This is something that just doesn't go away. So remove all other variables from this, and the Christians will just start persecuting themselves. Luckily, thank God, we have the separation of church and state in this country, where Congress doesn't have the ability to establish a national religion. And even if you choose to believe that all of the founding fathers were Christians, and therefore we are a Christian nation built on Christian principles, that doesn't really make a lot of sense now, does it? If it does make sense to you, let me put it to you this way. Imagine I call myself a Christian, right? Imagine that I wrote a parable or a book in which I instructed the reader to love Satan. Would you still call that book a Christian book? I mean, I'm Christian, right? Applying the same principles here. I'm Christian. If I write something that clearly goes against Christianity, would it still be called Christian just because the source was Christian? Probably not, right? I mean, it doesn't really make a lot of sense.